Okay, people should start being let in now. To all of those people who are just joining us, thank you so much for coming to our virtual edition of Science on Tap. We're so glad to have you all here. And this is our third virtual event so far. Still kind of getting the hang of it, but it's proven to be very fun. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Candis Watts Smith and Dr. Ray Block Jr., who are both Associate Professors of Political Science and African American Studies at Penn State, and they are going to discuss their research on race and racism in the US. Candis Watts Smith received her bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. in political science at Duke University, and her research explores the political and policy ramifications of shifting demographics in the US. She's the author of Black Mosaic, The Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Diversity, the co-author of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, and Racial Stasis, The Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics, and also the co-editor of Black Politics in Transition, Immigration, Suburbanization, and Gentrification. Ray Block Jr. earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy and political science from Howard University, and his master's and doctoral degrees in political science from The Ohio State University. His research interests include racial, ethnic, and gender differences in civic involvement, the formation and mutability of social identity, and campaigns and elections. He has published dozens of book chapters, manuscripts, and peer-reviewed articles, and is co-author of Losing Power, Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. He's also a senior analyst at the African American Research Collaborative and Latino Decisions. So in just a minute, we'll get to hear about their research, but first we're going to start off with just a few trivia questions related to these topics. So if you have an answer then to these questions, then you should be able to either raise your hand if that's an option, or we'll just call out the answers. So the first question is, what was the date when the last enslaved people in the US received word that they were freed? I'm actually not sure if people have a way to give us their answer right now. I guess you could type it into the Q&A. Well, a lot of us might.
Here we go.
Oh, let's see, we have something. Yes, perfect. June 19th, 1865, which was just celebrated very recently, Juneteenth. Awesome. Okay. The second question is, how does the incarceration rate of Black men compare to that of white men in the US? Way higher, yes.
Not wrong.
Yeah, I can say the statistic is about 6 times higher for Black men in the US. And our third and final trivia question, what percentage of US scientists and engineers are white?
Whoa.
97. Luckily, it's not quite that high. unfortunately 90 is actually the percentage of PhD degrees in my field in earth science, which are given to white people. But overall, in science and engineering, the overall percentage is about 67%. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for participating in that trivia session. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to our speakers. Candis, if you'd like to start, then we can start learning about the research you're doing.
Okay. This is my first webinar. Okay.
Awesome.
Can you guys see that okay? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it. That's great.
And so if people want to chime in with questions, Sierra or Hannah, you can interrupt me and I can answer.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone wants to ask a question, you can use the Q&A button to do so, and then we can ask. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think this will be so fun to just talk with you all, just to talk with people with kind of a different training and perspective. And I'm gonna try to keep it short so that we can like have dialogue and maybe just kind of come up with some new questions based on some of the things that I talk about today. So I study, generally speaking, the role of racial attitudes in American politics, and I study how democracy can serve to create or dismantle inequalities, especially racial inequality. I'm from North Carolina, but I've lived in Oklahoma, Texas, Massachusetts, Ohio, Illinois, and now I'm here in Pennsylvania. And I always find it really interesting when people seem to suggest that racism is like either special to the South, or if it's not exclusive to the South, then it's especially pernicious in the South. And I take issue with this because after living in a lot of different places in the US, it seems like a better characterization is that each place has its own special brand of racism, that it's not particular to one place or the other. And so, you know, I wrote this paper kind of to talk about that and a little bit to make fun of this business about the South being especially racist, but also just to kind of illuminate the extent to which negative racial attitudes kind of are all over the place. So let me take a step back and say, I think about racism in two ways. One is how most people think about it in terms of your attitudes and ideologies. So we might think about, how do groups feel about each other? What logic do they use to explain persistent inequalities, right? So that would be the ideology component. And then also we think about structural, or what everyone's talking about, systemic racism, right? So how do laws, policies, institutions create or perpetuate a racial hierarchy? And in the US, that is a place marked by where one group, particularly whites on average, receive more benefits, social, political, economic, psychological, I mean, like even the benefit of the doubt, right, than other groups on average. Okay, so what I want to do here is to just figure out a couple of things, two things. One is, are racial attitudes changing over time, the way that we tend to believe that we're kind of like always on this upward trajectory of progress? And then if we aren't, are some states, maybe it's a local issue, maybe some states are doing better than other states. And so maybe in some way we can be like, well, which state is the most racist? Like if we wanted to just chop it down to one sentence, can we figure that out? Okay. So one thing that we can do is we can look at trends. And here, what we're looking at is this one measure of racial attitude called racial resentment. And it's essentially kind of the way that, a way for people to say that they think that Black folks aren't doing well because they're not working hard and not necessarily because of a longer historical pattern of racial inequality. So it's a way to say racist things without being mean. Okay, we call this racial resentment in political science. And here you can see for the most part, that line is flat over time, even though we tend to think that that line should decrease, that resentment should go down over time, but that's not what we see. And we see this kind of bump in 2016 that goes kind of down, but you know, it's a good bump, but it's not like amazing. And we can talk about that more if you all want. But I like to study states. And I like to study states because that's really where all the action happens, right? Schooling, criminal justice, healthcare, marijuana. And when the federal government isn't doing stuff, we see a lot of states doing stuff around environmental, like it could be justice or it could be like, you know, environmental bad stuff. Or even immigration, which is supposed to be in the hands of the federal government, but sometimes states take over when there's a battle about power. So looking at states and what's going on in states is really important. And here, even though we saw that kind of basic line that we in this previous here, when we look at the states, we kind of see some things that could be interesting. So for example, like Mississippi, that pink line seems to be going down a little bit. And then like that blue, light blue dash line, for example, is going up. That's West Virginia, and it seems to be ticking up over time, right? So there's something about the states have their own patterns of progress or lack of progress. Hold on, am I getting a question? Oh yeah, okay, great. So racial resentment is made up of 4 questions, and we scale these questions. So the questions are like, the Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants made their way up without any help, and Blacks should too. Or I think that Blacks are getting less than they deserve or more than they deserve. Or there's another question that's like, generations of slavery have made it difficult for Black people to work their way out of poverty or something like that. So there's these kind of 4 questions, and then the way people respond, then we add them together, and this is how we get racial resentment. Thank you for that question, Angela. Okay, so let's see. So what I want to do is to basically create an intimate portrait of each of the states' level of racial resentment in their population. And there's this method called, warmly called Mr. P, but it's short for multi-level regression and post-stratification. And so what we do is we take data from over a long period of time. So I'm going to use the American National Election Survey that asks this question almost like every other year, or for sure ask all of the questions in most of the presidential years. And then we take data from the US Census. And essentially what we're doing is we are modeling public opinion as a function of the demographic characteristics of the state. And then we weight it. So what we're doing is the census gives us all these categories: non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic Blacks. And the census is, despite the fact that we give them all this data, oftentimes what we get is when we get it, then it says other, okay? And then gender, male, female, and then we have these 4 age categories and different education, and then we know the state. So what we do is we try to use the American National Election Survey to figure out what is the kind of average racial resentment for a non-Hispanic white male who's 18 years old, that has less than high school education, that lives in Alabama? And how much do we expect for a non-Hispanic Black female who's older than 65 with a lot of education in Wyoming? And we weight these groups depending on how many of them are in each of the states. Okay, so out of that, what we get is maps, lots and lots of maps. And what we're looking at here is for each year, we can kind of look to see which states have more racial resentment or less. So the dark green is more racial resentment, they're in quintiles. And the dark purple is less racial resentment. So here we can see that 88, 90, 92, 94, 2000, the South maintains its reputation as kind of the most racially having the most racial animus, having the greatest racial resentment. But then we see in 2004 a breakup of these blocks. Hold on, I'm reading Sophia's question. When quantifying the demographics, is that done based on population or proportion of the entire population? So what we do is we look at how many of the permutations are in each state, and we create a model that predicts what we expect a person in each type of person based on the permutations would have in each state. So if that is not clear, I can answer again in a longer Q&A. Okay, so what we do here is we see that in 2004, there's basically kind of like almost like a reorganization of those dark green states, right? And so it seems like the geography of the most racially resentful places shifts over time. So this business about the South being the most racially resentful or the most racist place is based on attitudes here is a little off base, particularly in this moment. And we can also see places that like maybe we didn't expect. So like Nevada, we got places out west. We have places like in the air quotes, what we, the flyover states, which if you live there, it's not a flyover state. You know what I mean? And so it's important just to note that we can see these kind of changes over the years. Yeah, so when I say I'm gonna explain why I'm saying don't compare across years in 1 second. So each map is its own, and each state is, in 1988, we look at all of 50 states and we rank all 50 states for 1988, then 1990, then 92. And in a second, it'll make sense why I'm saying don't compare years. Okay. So here's another way of giving this information about change over time. And so this blue dot that you see, if you kind of train your eye on it, it seems like it's going right down the center and over like this. So that is each state's racial resentment score in 1988, year one. Now, the reason why I point this out to you, one, is because I see how everything's kind of moved over. It's like, one, I think it's important. Oftentimes we kind of want to focus on, we would normally cut off the graph if we want it to be parsimonious at, let's say, 0.5. But I think it's important to see that there are a few relatively low racially resentful states. That's the one thing. The second thing is, if you see these circles, that's 1988. That's the first year that we see it. But we see here that there are shapes to the left and to the right of this circle of 1988, which means that there are years beyond 1988 that were worse in terms of their racial attitudes in that state. And we see in some places that their 2016 score is, their best or could be their worst, right? And so this business of this kind of linear improvement over time, we have no evidence for that. Okay, this is about the comparison across the states. So what we do here is each state year is its own data point. So we might think about like Texas 1988 as one data point, Texas 1990 as one data point, Texas 1992 as a data point, and so on and so forth. And so what we do is we give each state year a score, and then we line them up, and then we make them into deciles. So here what we can do is compare the states across, like look at them all together to see that in 1990, where there's a lot of blue, that was kind of a low racial resentment year nationally. And in 2008 and 2012, we see nationally, those were really high racial resentment years, right? And so again, this business of like a monotonic or consistent improvement in racial attitudes doesn't show, but we also see that within any particular state, there are ups and downs in the way that racial attitudes are presented. Okay, so why am I telling you guys all of this? The reason I'm saying all of these things and showing you all of these maps is because in a democracy, it is our expectation that a population's attitudes will shape policies, that policymakers and representatives are single-minded seekers of re-election, right? And they are paying attention to what their constituents are saying, what they believe. And so, you know, when we think about, well, which state is the most racist and which state is better and worse, I mean, one, we see that the states, you know, our geography about what is most racist is, even if we just look at attitudes, is a little off. But then we can also say, look, if we see how policies influence attitudes, influence policies, and policies influence attitudes, we see here that the top most racially disparate states are not in the South, right? And so how do we account for that in terms of racial attitudes? We expect people's attitudes in those states to inform the policies, or the 20 most segregated states in terms of where Black kids go to school. Some are in the South, but many are not. Or if we look at criminal disenfranchisement laws, we expect people's attitudes to influence how strict or how not strict these laws are, and similar to Medicaid expansion, right? And so ideally, Medicaid expansion would be, the policy would be developed around the need of the public. But what we see is that it's actually, that's not what is influencing Medicaid expansion. In part, it's the ideology and the party of that's in power, but also how people view who is deserving of Medicaid and who might get it most. And I guess I would just close to say that, you know, we're seeing this huge uprising and of sites of protest around the country that essentially was sparked by a film in Minnesota, right? And so what is it, right? How is it, why is it that other places seem to say like, hey, there's something going on here, we're having similar patterns? But if we think more broadly about what racism is and who we expect to be racist, or to where we expect to find racist attitudes, then that becomes more, we can understand it better, right? If we understand that negative racial animus can be found anywhere, everywhere, and in different intensities at different places, then we can see why there's a national response to an issue around that is essentially rooted, right, in anti-Black racism. So I'll stop there. Thank you. And thanks for your questions.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. It got me thinking a lot. Yeah, okay, so we can, unless anyone has questions that they want to address to Dr. Smith right now, then we can move on to Dr. Block, and we will be able to take questions for either one of our speakers at the end as well.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. That was a great
Perfect.
presentation. I appreciate being able to see that, Professor Smith.
Thanks, Ray.
Can y'all see this? Does this work?
I can see it, but it's a little bit fuzzy.
Uh-oh, okay.
If it's easier, I could also share it from my screen.
Could you please?
Yes.
I'll just give you a cue whenever a slide needs to move. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, let's see.
Is this event normally at a bar?
It is,
Yes.
yes. We usually do it at Federal Tap House.
Or your beer, good.
It's ginger beer. I'm trying to keep it professional, you know.
All right, can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah, that's better. You're gonna hit enable editing, Sierra. I don't know if only I'm seeing that.
Yeah, I can see it too.
Enable editing.
Also, Sierra, I have video for one of my slides, so I want you to set your volume.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh. Okay, is that better?
Oh, that's perfect. It looks great on my end. Thank
Looks
you, Sierra.
good.
Awesome.
All right, so thank y'all again. I'm really happy to be here. And it's always fun to be able to share research. And so I've been doing a lot of stuff related to race relations and COVID-19. So I want to share some of the stuff that relates to that. Next slide, please. So for me, I'm a storyteller and I'm going to tell you a story, and that story is going to go in 3 places. So very briefly, I'm going to tell you who I am and what I'm about, which is an extended version of the really good introduction that Sierra gave us. I'm also going to talk about how, in my opinion, the pandemic pulls the curtain back on race relations in the USA. So all the bad stuff that we had before, it's no longer hidden. Finally, what I'll do is I'll spend more time talking about politics. And so I'm going to talk about what I believe the pandemic tells us about voting in the upcoming election, and how race and class and the pandemic intersect to give us some really interesting stories about what's going to happen to come. Next slide, please. All right, so who am I and what do I study? Go ahead and go to the next one. So if I were to tell you what my tendencies are as an academic, basically everything I do is about social identity and political involvement. So for me, social identity can be gender and race and ethnicity. It could be sexuality, it could be ability. It could also be political party. It could also be geographic region. I am inherently interested in why people form groups and why those groups take on meaning. So that thing about political identity, social identity, had me interested in what I'm going to call political involvement. Involvement can be a lot of stuff. It could be how interested in politics you are, which was what my dissertation was about. It could be whether you vote. It could be whether you protest. It could be whether you give money to politicians or to causes. But the point of the matter is I look at the combination of social ID and political involvement in a bunch of ways. When I did my dissertation, I was looking at racial differences and how interested in politics people were. And what I noticed in 2008, a few years after I had finished my dissertation because I'm old, is that I noticed that Black people, while typically not as interested in politics as their white colleagues, became extraordinarily interested in politics. And obviously, Barack Obama's candidacy and subsequent presidencies had something to do with that. I was not trained as a presidency studies scholar, but I sort of became a presidency studies scholar because of what happened in 2008 and beyond. So I do some work that looks at the Obama candidacy and presidencies. I also do some work that looks at first ladies. And now I'm studying what race relations tells us about how to make sense of the Trump era, right? In addition to that, like Professor Smith, I study states from time to time. And a book that recently came out this year is one that I look at with my co-author, The Politics of Race and Class and Urban/Rural Status and Partisanship in the State of Tennessee. And that research informs a lot of the work that I do now. And that research is also informed by this inherent interest I have in studying social ID and political involvement. Some of my most recent work looks at how all of that stuff I just told you plays a role in how we understand people's ideas about police violence. And that makes me a little different than most people. Most people, when they study police violence, they want to look at, for example, racial differences in the outcomes of police violence. In other words, whether you can say there's a racial bias in the treatment of citizens when it comes to how they relate to the criminal justice system. What I'm looking at is whether or not people feel like there's a bias. And I want to know what people's attitudes about that perceived bias, if there is a perceived bias. So all of this stuff, I want you to think, found a way into this research that I'm doing on COVID-19. Next slide, please. So race relations in the pandemic. This is not a news story. You can go ahead to the next slide. But the pandemic is terrible, full stop. We don't even have to qualify that statement. It just so happens that however the pandemic is terrible, it's extra terrible for communities of color. So the two slides I'm going to show you here, one of them is looking at racial disparities in the health outcomes as they relate to COVID-19. So these two pie charts you see here are responses that people gave us to two surveys about whether or not they know someone who's either gotten sick from COVID-19 or who's passed away from COVID-19. And we divide the results up so that we have Black folks on one side of the graph and we have respondents who self-identify as white on the other side of the graph. And the fact that there's any turquoise blue showing in these pie charts is already upsetting. But the fact that there's noticeably more blue for the African-American respondents than there are for the white respondents gets to this general thing that I want to share with you about how much more disparately upsetting and unsettling and dangerous and depressing and just sheer badly, how bad it is for people of color when it comes to living in this world with the pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, hits to your health are one thing, but there's a very clear conversation happening in this country about hits to your wealth. And the same thing that I told you before about the pandemic doing extra damage to communities of color applies when we're talking about economic circumstances too. In fact, I recently had a piece that I published with a graduate student who's a former attendee of Penn State, by the way. And we talk about the disparate outcomes for Black communities when it comes to the pandemic's effect on things that are bad with the economy. And I'm putting this out here because I want you to look at everything that I give you from now on under the backdrop of COVID-19 being bad for everybody and it being especially bad for Black folks. Next slide, please. All right, so we paint this picture that's not very happy about the pandemic. Let's talk about how that relates to politics and still looking at racial differences. Next slide, please. There's a survey that came out in May that the Kaiser Family Foundation put on, and they ask a basic question. They ask people, what's the most important factor when it comes to you thinking about what's going to get you to go out to vote? And people are allowed to say what those things are. And the survey company actually itemized what those things are. So I think it's important to look at the top and the bottom of this graph. And so at the top of this graph, you see the pandemic as something that several respondents mentioned. And at the bottom, you see the economy and you see healthcare as things that people mentioned. Look at the differences between the groups. So African Americans are substantially more likely to say the pandemic is something that's weighing heavily on their decision to vote. Now, likewise, healthcare, which is related to the pandemic, is also something that a substantial number of African Americans are saying is weighing heavily on their decision to vote. You get a flipped sort of response setup if you look at the economy, for example, where self-identified white respondents are more likely, noticeably so, than their African American colleagues to say that that particular thing is going to be a major motivator in their decision to vote. Next slide, please. Going beyond looking at major issues, I feel like it's important to think about how folks feel about the candidates. And I'm going to call these job approval ratings, but they're job approval ratings based on the pandemic. And so the survey question that you see that animates the stacked bar graphs you're looking at across the slide here are a question about how respondents believe that certain entities in government are doing when it comes to handling the pandemic. And I think the easiest thing to do, because there's a lot of information here, is to look at the green chunks in each of these bar graphs, because the green chunks tell you the percentage of respondents who said that whoever that entity was doing a poor job at managing the pandemic. And if you focus on the left side of the screen here, what you notice is that there's a noticeable racial gap between Black and white respondents when it comes to the number of people who believe that Donald Trump is not doing a good job managing the pandemic. And the gap gets much smaller across the racial groups if you go across other levels of government. So at the state level, you're looking at governors, and anything below the state level, looking at local officials, you don't see as stark a racial difference as you see when you're looking at Donald Trump. And this finding interests me so much that I want to talk about it in more detail. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I just have Trump ratings here, and I'm breaking them by race. These are not the same surveys, but the whole point of it is I wanted to paint a descriptive picture of what trends look like when it comes to job approval ratings for the president. And it's pretty clear that African Americans, increasingly so since March, are saying that Trump is doing a poor job when it comes to managing the pandemic. White respondents are relatively stable compared to their Black colleagues in terms of how they feel about this. But I think it's worth noting that when you get into June, roughly half the respondents are saying that Trump is doing a bad job, and then roughly half are not. So it's even noteworthy among white respondents, the sheer number of people that are deeming Trump's response to the pandemic as being not excellent. And in this case, flat out bad. Next slide, please. Now, still looking at responsiveness, these are similar setups to the last set of charts I gave you, but this time I'm looking at people's job approval ratings, and I break it into positive versus negative responses. So I took the fair and poor and combined them into negative ratings, and I took the good and the excellent and combined those and made those into positive ratings. The thing that I want you to look at are the purple graphs, the purple bars in this case, and those are for folks in the South. And we're looking at the perceived responsiveness in this case of governors. And I think it's very interesting to note here, especially with the really great setup we got from Professor Smith about geographic region and state level differences, that people who responded to this survey who reside in southern states are giving the least positive ratings for their governors when it comes to how their governors are managing the pandemic. Now I'm going to step back and think about all of the stuff that I showed you. So I showed you some, what I'm going to call job approval ratings at different levels of government. At the federal level, there's a strange amount of consensus across race. Well, not strange, but there's a noteworthy amount of consensus across respondents in types of race in terms of how they feel about Trump's involvement in the management of the pandemic. Responses get a little more interesting when you break that down into things beyond just the president's response. But it's very noteworthy to me that if you're looking at this stuff across region, the place where you see the, I guess, job approval ratings being least positive are in the places where there was more of a rush to reopen, and in places where I would argue that the decision to reopen was based more on economic concerns and less on science, and less on medical concerns, and less on things that would be reasoned to be the kind of things that would make respondents who are already disproportionately worried about the pandemic respond in the way that they did. Next slide, please. All right, so let's look at candidate preference, because I want to talk about politics. So this is some horse race stuff. So if the election were today, who do you got, right? I have a survey that I recently did back in May, and that's what you see on the left side of the slide. So the pie chart on the left is Black registered voters from a poll I recently was involved in. The slide on the right is actually a composite of a whole bunch of surveys that were done, and the composite was compiled at realclearpolitics.com. So I'm taking a poll of the polls for the right side. And I wanted to compare Black voters to what the national averages were. And in this case, you can see clearly, if you go from the left side of this graph, the left side of this whole slide to the right, that there's a definite difference in who's getting support if you were to break this down by race. And so Black people compared to everyone else is a way of thinking about this. And when you're looking at everyone else, the race is a lot tighter between Biden and Trump. Now, currently, Biden's in the lead, And that lead is not even as small, like it's smaller here in this composite than what recent polls are saying. But it still looks like this is a race where both candidates need to compete for the attention and for the approval of voters. If you look at Black registered voters, it's really tempting to not get that impression. In other words, it's tempting to say, for example, that Biden's getting like 75% of the Black vote and to assume that Biden's off to a great start. I would actually argue against that, though. The reason why I would argue against that, though, is because if you know the history of party and race in the United States, since the civil rights era, Republican candidates have gotten between 8 and 10% of the Black vote. And Trump's falling right in line with what other candidates have gotten who are Republican candidates in presidential elections. And the only two presidential candidates of recent years that didn't get between 8 and 10% of the vote from Black people were John McCain and Mitt Romney. And John McCain and Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama, who did better than a typical Democrat when it comes to securing the Black vote. So if Romney and McCain are the outliers and most of the GOP candidates get, let's just say, roughly 10% of the Black vote, then that means that Biden should be in the 90s if Biden wants to be consistent with other Democratic candidates. And there's a possibility for that to happen. It's really only just starting to get close to the general election. But I would look at these findings and say that Biden's got a lot of work to do because the consolidation of Black voters around him is currently not happened yet. Next slide, please. All right, so the last set of data I'll show you is that I've been talking about the pandemic and I've been talking about politics. And it stands to reason that it's really natural to assume that the pandemic might have something to do with turnout. And the logic would be that if the pandemic is as bad as we say it is, and if things are really moving in that direction, you would expect the pandemic to weigh in on people's decisions to go out and vote. We actually saw that in an earlier slide where people were saying it factored in a major way into how people would make a decision about whether they would go out and vote or not. The poll that I did tried to ask this question directly to respondents. It literally asked them, based on what's going on with the pandemic, are you more likely to vote, less likely to vote, or does it make no difference at all? And these findings are both heartening in the sense that they suggest that the pandemic isn't slowing Black people down. But it's also important to consider that these folks that are saying that they are more likely to vote in light of a pandemic are saying that with full knowledge of the fact that the pandemic is not only bad in general, but it's especially bad for African Americans. Something to think about. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you a brief video because I feel like we could stop talking about voting and talk about protest. So you're going to have to click that. Try it again.
Let's hope my Wi-Fi works. All right.
I think if you need to, you could open it in another window. I think if you like right click it maybe.
Oh, sorry, my Wi-Fi is very overwhelmed right now.
Oh, it's okay. I don't think we need it. I was just going to show some footage of the recent protests here in State College. And so
Yeah.
just think of that as a backdrop.
We can put it on our website if you send us
Yeah,
the link
definitely.
later so people can check it out.
Be happy to do that.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
not a problem. You can go to the next slide.
All right.
All right, so final one after this. So what does all of this tell us about race, the pandemic, and politics and all of that stuff? So because I'm thinking about this in terms of how it's going to affect politics, I can give you what I'm going to call a good news story and a bad news story. The bad news first, that race relations already sucked. before the pandemic, and they haven't gotten any better. And it's naive to believe that they would have, and it's naive to continue to think that they might, right? So I believe that everything that's going on in the world right now has literally pulled the curtain back on many of the troubling issues that we have in the United States when it comes to race relations. That's the bad news. The good news is, I don't think that racial progress needs to be a partisan issue. Now, if you're like me and you're paying attention to TV, I got folks now that are watching NASCAR to see about what's going on with racial issues being talked about and addressed in a progressive way in NASCAR, right? We had Roger Goodell of the NFL on TV talking about Black Lives Mattering. We have people across the globe of all colors and all races and all demographic backgrounds protesting almost arm in arm about racial injustice. This is a moment, and this is a unique moment in history for a lot of reasons, partly because of the other things that are going on, but also because we're noticing real shifts in people's opinions about racial progress. And because of that, I believe if you're thinking about this strategically, politicians can take on racially progressive issues in a way that they probably couldn't in other contexts, because racial issues, if you take stances on them that are progressive, you might not necessarily incur the costs that you might have incurred before. In other words, there was a period of time when being racially progressive meant that you ran the risk of losing voters. And I'm not sure, and I guess time will tell, whether or not taking racially progressive stances will indeed lose you voters the way that it would have in previous electoral cycles. Now, having said that, I think the politicians who understand the moment and who are able to mobilize effectively around the momentum that's being built when it comes to the demands for racially progressive agendas in government will be the ones that are going to be successful. That's all I got, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very insightful as well. Okay. Stop sharing the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see this, Bianca. There was a thing about how you could play the video.
Oh. Yeah, the video on my computer was not playing just because of my Wi-Fi issue. So we'll email that out through our serve, and also we can post it on our website. I definitely would like to get it. I'm sure others would as well. All right, so now we can open it up for any questions, and you can ask questions for either of our speakers or both of them. All right, we have one here. There was a lot of emphasis on Black-white disparities or animus. What are your thoughts on other minority groups? For example, racial discrimination by Latino or Asian groups on the Black community.
So I'm doing some polling now with Latino decisions where we're replicating some of the questions that we did in our May 2020 poll deeper into the summer so that we can actually do a comparison to gauge how these things work out across racial and ethnic groups. Now, anecdotally, we know that a lot of the progressive racial attitude policy agendas are shared across African Americans and Latinos. We also know that African Americans and Latinos are two of the hardest hit groups when it comes to the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has. So it would make sense that policy preferences would be aligned between at least those two groups. I can at least speak on that part of it.
Mm-hmm. To add, I would say, I think actually the question is a really important one, and a strange answer perhaps might be to give is about like a historical question, in that in political science, in American politics in particular, the main question has been about what white people think about Black people. And it's a question that it's not becoming outdated, but we realize that there's more complexity there, right? Because, for example, the largest minority group is not Black, it's Latinx, right? And so that's one thing. Like, some of the questions that we're able to answer over time have to do with who got to ask questions in surveys in the first place. But also, I suppose, just to answer in a more contemporary way, I think that one of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement has made very clear is that even our kind of understanding of who's Black and who's Latino and who's Asian are not necessarily always mutually exclusive. And the issues that are faced by Black folks are faced by Latino people or Asian American people too, and vice versa. So even in this like DACA moment, we have to also keep in mind that there are Black DACA recipients, right? And so I think that just kind of as political science, the people who study our areas of work diversifies, that there are going to be more people who can answer this question better, who are going to get better data. But the question that you're asking is one that speaks to a larger issue around who gets included in political science faculty and graduate studies in the first place.
Okay, we have another question here. Professor Smith showed figures of racial resentment across time, including these years, and it appeared there was a larger amount of racial resentment in years that Obama was elected, less in the year Trump was elected. Yeah, could you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there are two things. There are two things that I think can be going on, and it's one that I'm really interested in learning more about, but I'm kind of waiting for 2020 to swing around. And I think one of the things that I think is happening in 2016 was that Trump was so extra, like so overtly bigoted, that people didn't want to answer those questions. Like, you know, when the questions were developed in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of a subtle way to ask about race. But now if you ask those questions, like even when I said them, like the Irish, Italian, and Jewish, I'm sure people are like, what, why are you asking? Like, that's a weird question to ask, right? And so that cues up people, oh, they must be asking me if I'm a racist. And I'm going to be super sure that I'm not going to answer that question that way. So I think that's one possible reason is that people in response to Trump they didn't want to be in that group. I think the other thing that could be happening is that there are more millennials in the 2016 ANES than in other surveys, because millennials are now grown up people. And so I have some other research that shows that when millennials answer those questions, they're not actually answering them with the same points of reference in mind as older white Americans. So that tick down could be because there are more millennials in the sample, but it doesn't necessarily mean that millennials have lower racial animus. It just means that we're comparing apples and oranges when we present the questions to them.
That's interesting. Okay, we've got another question here. Another question for either. Do you believe disparities between ethnic groups in academic performance is always / only indicative of systematic racism? For example, I was the only African American in my nuclear engineering program at Penn State, and this is consistent among most nuclear engineering programs. Wouldn't that explain some of the lack of African American representation in STEM?
Yeah, I would say it is okay. I think that we can agree, most of us can agree, and that talent is equally distributed across racial groups, but opportunity is not. So there are probably many more Black folks who are perfectly capable of performing well in a nuclear engineering program at Penn State or any place else, but whether the opportunity to feed into a graduate program was presented is not necessarily equal across racial groups. So I would say that, yeah, the lack of African American representation in STEM is actually, I saw something on the news. You know, like we're all consuming because we're just staying at home all the time. We just like consume information all the time. But it was talking about how we don't have enough people in STEM. And this is going to become a national security problem because we don't have enough computer scientists, and we don't have enough engineers, and we don't have enough chemists, and we don't have enough, all of these epidemiologists, all of these people. And part of it is because we have produced such pernicious inequalities in K through 12 education that we are wasting away the talent that's just sitting there in Black and Brown communities that aren't getting the resources, tools, opportunities, know-how, programs to get in order for like the rest of us to be able to benefit from this like reservoir of talent that is not that's not being used. So yes, I do not think it's like biological or inherent, or it's about laziness or hard work. I don't think actually it's about any of those things. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of data that show that once we account for wealth disparities, a lot of the things that we associate with race go away. But we know that we have major wealth disparities between whites and Blacks in particular, with other groups in the middle.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It made me think about this article that I read recently, written by Dr. Ayanna Johnson. She's a Black ocean conservationist, and she was talking about like the role of racism in distracting people. She told like a short story about her friend who had wanted to be an engineer, but had thought that the negative race relations were more pressing, and then had therefore become a community organizer. So yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. The other thing that comes to mind is like how I've been hearing a lot of people talk about how like environmental science has kind of focused, and environmentalists have focused on conservation and not necessarily justice. And so that has also been kind of like a push-pull for people of color who are like, well, I want to study environmental issues because the water in my community is bad, right? Not necessarily like to save this park for the certain kind of birds. Now, it's not to say that this kind of birds shouldn't be saved. They should be, but just kind of the emphasis on conservation rather than justice has also kind of led people of color, I think, into different areas of work and study as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like we could probably discuss this for a long time. There's just so many things like influencing the lack of representation in STEM. But since we are already a little bit running over time, let's move on to this next question. Would candidate preference change if Biden selected an African American VP? Why or why not?
All right, so I think that the better question is how, and not why/why not, right? And so we're thinking about this in terms of a Black politics perspective. And so Biden's already committed to having a woman vice president pick. Doesn't have to be a Black woman, but the question is about a Black woman. So how would it matter is a good way of thinking about this. And so I'm a firm believer that if it's going to matter, it's going to depend on who he picks for a vice president. And so, I mean, I saw an article recently about Condoleezza Rice being in the running, and I'm like, hell no, right? So like it actually matters whether or not the person he picks is a person who can seize upon what I feel like is the momentum towards a progressive racial justice political agenda. A candidate like that could do something. But what they might do is they might actually boost turnout more than they affect candidate preference, because I do believe that the numbers that we're seeing for Biden right now will improve. It's incumbent upon Biden to do the work, but I think Biden can make appeals to Black voters to convince Black voters that have, if he's elected, that a progressive racial agenda or a social justice agenda will be something that'll be pursued. And I'll be the first to tell you, I think that the contest, at least for Black voters, is not between Trump and Biden. It's between Biden and the couch. In other words, it's the decision to actually show up in November, as opposed to not showing up. And a lot of Black voters have made a choice. And that choice was informed by things before COVID-19, but COVID-19 has added an extra emphasis to a lot of Black voters on how not suitable Trump would be for a presidential candidate.
I agree.
That's a good point. Okay. Do we have any last minute questions? Those were a lot of good questions. Thank you all. And thank you to our speakers, Professor Block and Professor Smith. This was very educational and informative, and just a lot of very important things. So I hope that we can continue these conversations, and I want to—
Can I answer this last one?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I love this question. And I also like Perry's enthusiasm throughout this whole thing. So what would it take to have mail-in voting for all 50 states? So voting is a state issue. The states have to decide on their own what they're going to do about this. So the business of voting, I think we tend to think about it as a guaranteed right. It is not. If you look at the Constitution, it does not give any of us the right to vote. All of our rights to vote, who can vote, where we can vote, when we can vote, all of those things have to do with the states. So it is not standard practice because voting is in the realm of the state. And so this is the kind of thing that you want to look and see what your state is doing. Like Pennsylvania doesn't have early voting, but they did very good on this kind of mail-in voting. I was thoroughly impressed. Other states have early voting. Some states have all mail-in voting. And it's gonna be that patchwork that we've seen in COVID is the same patchwork that we're seeing in voting. It's the same patchwork that we see in policing. So this is why I really like this question, just because it gives me the chance to say that you have to pay attention to what your state representatives are doing. Like the president matters, your congressional people matter, the Senate matters, but the people in your state are the ones who are going to help you to turn your power to speak your mind into actual ballots in this moment. That's all. Thanks, Perry, Pierre, and Hannah, and Ray.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
That was a
Thank
great
you
one
all.
to end on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I wish we could keep going. I know that there's so much more we could talk about. It was a really, really great event, and I thank you all for coming, especially our speakers. Thank you so much, and I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. And definitely feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions or want to have any sort of involvement with Science Policy Society in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Great talks.
Appreciate it.
All right. See you all.
See you.